Thank you to the International Death Symposium happening September 21st to 23rd in Toronto for sponsoring this video. Stay tuned to the end to learn more. Hello everyone, my name is James Gesso. I am the host of Adventures to the Mind and the author of Decomposing the Shadow and the True Light of Darkness. This YouTube channel is, as you probably noticed, reasonably psychedelic and pertains to issues within psychedelic culture, although many of those issues also apply to people outside of psychedelic culture as well. And one of the issues that applies to absolutely everybody, but gets a lot of talk in the psychedelic culture, is this issue of dying. Now, inside psychedelic culture, there's this meme of the ego death. And there's a lot of interesting consideration around the impact of an ego death, which is wherein you take psychedelics and you take enough of them that it feels as though you die, or that your ego dies, or you no longer identify with your normal state of self, as though the person you once were is no longer existing, and awareness seems to carry on and maintain some sort of essence. But all that said, an ego death is not really dying. An ego death on psychedelics, yes, has a lot of similar attributes to dying, as far as, dying people might communicate, or at least it feels as though we're dying, and in that sense can have a relational potency. An ego death on psychedelics can have a very strong relationship to how we engage the dying process later, which is clearly represented in the research around psilocybin administration for end of life anxiety, which I'll talk about in a separate video. But it still isn't dying. And one thing that I notice inside of the psychedelic culture that I feel is kind of juvenile, and juvenile in the sense that it remains attached to this heroic archetype where the hero actually is the immature version, according to archetypal psychology, to the king or the queen. But it stays with this, oh yeah, I faced death, and it's as if now that I've died on psychedelics and experienced that, my awareness continued, that somehow now I'm no longer afraid of death. And fair play, maybe after an experience like that, you are no longer afraid of death and you have a deep sense of trust for what might follow the dying time. If your experience with ego death on psychedelic translates to no longer being impacted or no longer being moved by the consequence of truly acknowledging that we are going to die, at some point, everything that we know about this life will no longer be, as far as we know, available to us. At the very least, we're going to pass through an encounter with that. I'm not going to go on to what I think about what happens after death, but if after a psychedelic ego trip, ego trip. After a psychedelic ego death, there's this sense that, oh, well, I'm no longer impacted by death. It's like I have no longer fear. Well, I actually think that's an ego trip. I think that is the psychedelic's ability to strengthen the ego, sometimes in a good way, but other times in a self-absorbed and immature way. I think that if you're not afraid of death, or at least if you don't feel as though the acknowledgement of our dying is absolutely relevant and impactful, it has consequence in the way we live our daily lives, then you're deluded away from the truth. The sense of no longer having fear is likely some sort of ego defense mechanism to protect you from whatever is actually there. Now, this is a bunch of assumptions that I'm making now about how an ego death does not translate into actually a capacity to navigate our real dying. And I think that making that point is important, because one of the issues, as I started this video out with, that impacts everybody, is that we are going to die. And here in the Western world that I live in, the mostly secular Western world, it appears as though we're in this weird combination of death phobia and death obsession. Nobody wants to talk about it. There's stigma around it. Oh, it's morbid. We try to stay away from the actuality of our dying process. We live every day as if we'll have many more days to follow. We live every day as if we'll live forever. We often just let things that could be otherwise amazing and just strike us with deep, profound gratitude for being alive just pass us by as we get obsessed with the little quibbles about bullshit in our everyday life, as if this life will last forever, as if we, this moment in time is a given, as if this opportunity to be alive is a given. And so it seems as though we have this death phobia anywhere that dying and the impact of dying is actually real. And we have this death obsession in all the places where it doesn't have to feel real, where we know it's just pretend, where we know it's just entertainment. And so we're afraid of actually touching the reality of our dying, and yet obsessed with encountering it as often as possible as forms of hollow entertainment. And I imagine both of which very muchly are intertwined expressions of the same deep, deep anxiety we have about the mystery and the pain and the grief that is present in dying, in our own dying, and in the dying of other people, that we haven't been given any real, valid, palpable, strong, and secure cultural means to understand and to engage with. Are dying as if it's something meaningful, as if it's something beautiful. Think about it this way, and this is another paraphrase of Stephen Jenkinson. How many things in your life can you think of that increased their value the more of it you got? And the same can be said about life. It's when we know and understand our limitations that its value really becomes clear. That's when the richness of it can all come together. But the challenge here is that in order to access the richness that is our direct relationship to the impact, to the consequence of knowing that we will and everyone we know will die, that impact on our life, in order to access it, we need to access a lot of feelings that are not only not prioritized in our everyday life, in our modern culture, but actually demonized. Sorrow, sadness, heartbreak, grief. We're very illiterate as a culture to deal with these things. And as a consequence, I believe as a consequence of our illiteracy in dealing with these uncomfortable, dark emotions, we have an increase in mental illness and mental disorders. But I don't want to talk about thoughts on mental illness and mental disorders. I really want to focus on dying, because I think that it really behooves us, not just in our own lives, but beyond us. It behooves us to actually take some time and to do our absolute best in community, if we can do it, to really touch the reality of our dying, and to not be afraid to talk about it, to really even so cross that threshold of fear into talking about it with other people, and even to cross that threshold of fear into the fear and be there with that. Acknowledging our death is what gives us the capacity to really love our lives. I'll give you an example from my own life. Although a lot of you know that I suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder for about 3 years as a consequence of nearly dying, the day after I nearly died, the morning after, I was walking and I happened to hear the wind blow through the leaves and the trees, and I looked up and I could see just this, totally average, totally ordinary moment of light passing through leaves moving as the wind passed through them, the sound, the textures. I became very aware of smells, and I collapsed to my knees, crying in gratitude and in grief. And that grief was a blessing in a way. And again, to paraphrase Stephen Jenkinson, who is my favorite teacher on this subject, there's as much joy as there is sorrow in grief. And although I passed through post-traumatic stress disorder as a consequence of not having the right support structures for me after that encounter, like very messy medical emergency encounter with my own dying, having passed through those 3 years and having been forced over those 3 years to really touch it almost every day, at that time in a fairly unhealthy way, because I was having anxiety attacks and I was feeling depressed, touching it eventually as I came to really know how to hold myself with it as best as I can here at 32 years old, it moves me. And I feel so grateful to be so aware of the fact that I am going to die. And not only that I am going to die, that I have no idea how long my life is. And I have no idea if I'm going to die before my friends or my family or, like, God forbid, my nephews. I have no idea about any of that. And that is a huge mystery. And that is, in some ways, a huge burden. It's very heartbreaking. And at the same time, that heartbreak is really, it's freeing in a way, because it's just so real, and it just calls me so deeply into appreciating what I have now in this moment, and knowing that how I show up to my relationship to death, which is present with me right now, not that I'm dying or that I'm about to pass through into death. I'd probably be a lot more anxious right now if that were the case. It's not to say that I think we should get comfortable with it, but I think we should get familiar with it. The reality that my death is with me because it was entrusted to me at my birth. And as I engage it, as I learn to live in a way that does not hide from it, that does not quiver from it, but meets it in the place where I'm vulnerable, and it hurts, and I cry and I grieve, and I'm heartbroken by how much sadness will come of this, and how much sadness people will feel as a consequence of my death, and how I will feel for the consequence of my parents' die, if I'm so lucky for them to not have to witness my own death. All of that hurts, and yet it really brings a lot of perspective to how valuable my relationships are, how valuable it is to know that I have been gifted this one opportunity at life. And that doesn't make it all okay. That doesn't make it easy to deal with. That doesn't make it a simple process. No, it's difficult. It makes it mysterious. It makes it so big, so much bigger than my own capacity. And there's something to be said, and again, like, I'm just referencing Stephen Jenkinson because, like, he's my guy when it comes to this stuff, is that the meaning of my death isn't even my own. And when I die, the impact of it, although of course it will be deeply personal during my dying time, the meaning and impact of it won't be mine. It will be those who are with me at the time. And if I live my life in a way wherein I can become increasingly familiar with grieving, with an open, astute acknowledgement of the reality of dying, so that I can be with it when the time comes, in a way that at the very least actually acknowledges it's happening when it's happening, and actually allows the impact of that acknowledgement to move me and to move my friends and family with me as I weep, and we weep together, and we grieve, and I really feel at the end of life the richness of all that I have cultivated up until this point, and as a consequence of being with that, offer unto those who are present a different meaningfulness to what dying is, one that flies in the face of what we've been given by our culture as it stands, by the dominant culture of North America, which is that dying is an affliction, dying is a trauma, dying is something that we must fight against over and over again. It is something almost unjust in some way. And yet that's not true. If anything, it is the most just thing we could consider, that we should have to give our lives back after they've been entrusted to us for so long. And that we might, if we're diligent, if we really choose to get familiar, if we really choose while we are living to learn to relate to life inside of the limitations that it has, that maybe we might be able to pass on something really beautiful to those who follow us. For all the reasons I just mentioned, this is important to consider, but in particular to those of us who are in the psychedelic culture and exploring the impact of a psychedelic ego trip, the impact of psychedelic experiences in general, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that although an ego death experience on psychedelic can be so positive, can be so impactful, and can be very relieving in and around a lot of the anxieties we hold about dying and can bring a lot of that gratitude that I mentioned earlier for being alive, that the ego death is not really dying. And although it is going to be helpful, absolutely, if it went well, it's not the end all and be all of learning how to relate to dying. It is not. And we need to do that extra work. And it's the hard work and it's the challenging work. And the reality is that most of that work won't even be for us. It'll be for our loved ones, for our friends, for the generations to follow us. So I think about dying a lot. And I know that some of my other friends have expressed that they find this morbid and it makes them worried for my well-being. They tell me, well, don't give in to despair. Like don't think about it too much. Don't let it affect you. And God damn it, I want it to affect me. I know what it feels like now to love my life as a consequence of knowing that it will end. And so I want to talk to you about it. I want to express these ideas. And I also want to learn more. I want to engage more. I want to really invest myself to be learned and to learn to be sad and to learn to be heartbroken and to learn to die well. So that at the end of my life, whenever that might be, hopefully, I'd like it to be a really long time from now, but I can't control that. But at the end of my life, that I can die in a way that gives onto those who are around me a sense that dying is not a defeat. It's not an affliction. It's not a trauma. It is the right and just completion of a lived life. And I've wanted to shoot this video for a long while, and to express my ideas about it, which aren't 100% confirmed. Like I said, I'm only 32, and, would that I have another 50 years, to get better at this whole dying thing, and this whole sadness and grieving thing. But I did want to talk about it because I feel it's an important issue. And like I said, I want to learn more and more. And so I just got this amazing opportunity to do this video and speak my own ideas, and have it be sponsored by the International Death Symposium that is happening in Toronto from September 21st to the 23rd of 2018. And they encouraged me to talk about whatever I want to talk about around dying and share what's meaningful to me and what's salient, and for them to sponsor this video. So I'm really grateful to the International Death Symposium for doing so. Let me tell you a little bit about this conference because I think it's going to be really amazing, and it's doing something that a lot of places aren't doing, and I think it's establishing cultural spaces that can help to counteract that issue of death phobia that I opened up the intro of this video discussing. They describe it as an innovative gathering of some of the most influential, stimulating, and inspiring minds and changemakers, from medical and wellness leaders to world-renowned authors, musicians, and Indigenous teachers from North America and beyond. It's about having the conversations and reconciling our relationship and understanding of life and death, which is really everything that I just talked about in this video. And I also, I multiple times referenced Stephen Jenkinson because I absolutely love this man's work. He's going to be speaking at this conference, as well as TED alumni BJ Miller, as well as author and YouTube celebrity Caitlin Doty, who runs the podcast Ask a Mortician. If you would like to learn more about the International Death Symposium, and I encourage you to do so, I've left a link in the description below where you can find out more about who's going to be speaking and some of the complexities around getting yourself to Toronto in order to participate in this symposium. So thank you for listening to this video all the way to the end. My name is James Jesso for Adventures to the Mind. I'll see you soon.